Back in 1987, the original Final Fantasy kicked into gear following a simple prophetic opening that would set the stage for the game and for the series that it would go on to spawn. It talked about a dying world and a prophecy that would make reference to 4 young warriors chosen by destiny who, when the time was right, would reveal themselves to save the world and restore order. Let's face it, in some shape or form, this describes a lot of stories in the fantasy genre. Final Fantasy didn't exactly break new ground here. Other games, books, and movies have all presented epic tales along these basic lines. But at the same time, Final Fantasy did approach this mythic concept with its own style, creating signature tropes that would then be utilised as we saw the series progress in terms of both the quality of the overall scenario, but also how it was delivered. And this is something that's rather important to consider. Final Fantasy XV, for example, has more lines of dialogue in its first chapter than the original Final Fantasy had throughout the entirety of the game, and it's because of this expansion that the utilization of certain tropes has been able to become a lot more subtle. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about the Warrior of Light motif, something that was introduced with the original game, but has been used as a story mechanic throughout many of the different titles within the main series. It was a topic that was suggested by Richard Sivak, who's one of our premium Patreon supporters, and we thought it was such a fascinating topic that we're hoping to expand the concept for future videos relating to other tropes that we've seen adopted throughout the series. And to make sure that things are extra on point here, we're also working on this series with Chris, aka Hugathy, who you may remember from our What If video relating to Steiner. Before we dive into the waters of mythology though, do not forget to hit that notification button, even if you are already a subscriber of Final Fantasy Union. And if you'd like us to make a video about a topic of your choosing, be sure to check out our Patreon at patreon.com/FFUnion to find out how you can do so. So, as mentioned, the Warriors of Light concept was created for the original game, and it served as an overarching plot device to drive the story forward. We were presented with a relatively thin story that would see characters who were essentially empty avatars defined only by their generic appearances, their 4-letter names and their specific Warrior of Light job title, arrive bearing orbs at a time when the world was in despair. These orbs would be the tools that would help them to stop the Earth's rot, the sea's rage, and so on and so forth, and the warriors would need to rekindle these orbs with light from the world's 4 core elements: Earth, Fire, Water, and Wind. It was a very simple premise, and it was, of course, a sign of the times. Video game narratives, like many other aspects of video game development, just weren't that advanced back then. It meant we had a story where, in reality, we knew next to nothing about our simple heroes. We had no idea where they came from, why they alone would have the power to save the world, and why they should even care about the plight of this world. We just knew that destiny had chosen them, the orbs were somehow shoved into their hands, and they were sent to do their job with no questions asked. It would see our Warriors of Light defeat vicious fiends that would correspond to the 4 aforementioned elements, something which itself would turn into another signature trope, the 4 fiends. And after doing so, they would restore the light and then go back in time to confront their true enemy, Chaos, an evil godlike figure who is pulling the strings behind the scenes. Now, even though the premise was rather skeletal, it did serve to establish a lot of familiar elements that would become hallmarks of Final Fantasy. So let's see how this torch was passed on in later games, starting with Final Fantasy III. As with Final Fantasy II, they actually chose to go in a rather different direction. Here, with Final Fantasy III, as in the original, we were presented once again with a quartet of avatars known canonically only as the Warriors of Light. This was of course changed later on in the Nintendo 3DS remake, as the 4 characters were renamed to Luneth, Arc, Refia, and Ingus, and they were each given unique personalities. But either way, in the original version, these Warriors of Light would again be chosen by destiny to save the world. But this time, we would actually get to see the moment that they were selected by destiny, as they would fall into a cave and discover one of the elemental crystals. It then fell on their young shoulders to save the world from the encroaching darkness summoned by the evil Xande. To do this, they learnt that they must venture across the world, restoring the power of their 4 elemental crystals, which were identical to the elements seen in the first game. There is an interesting twist on the Warrior of Light mythology here though, as we discover that there is also a world of darkness. Mirroring the calamity our heroes needed to stop, the destructive power of the light was once poised to consume this second world. It was saved though by 4 warriors of darkness, who ultimately end up lending their strength to the warriors of light in the interest of preserving the balance between darkness and light, so that both worlds may prosper. It would see them journey to an outer world place, the World of Darkness, to defeat their true enemy, Cloud of Darkness, an embodiment of entropy itself, driven to consume all existence and return it to the void. And by the end of Final Fantasy III, we got to see some of the common threads that were woven between the first and third Final Fantasies. The Warriors of Light are 4 young heroes. They are the only ones that can save the world, and they're chosen by destiny. They must then take a pilgrimage to restore elemental tools and then travel beyond their own world to confront the godlike entity that threatens all life. We next heard the term Warriors of Light in Final Fantasy V, and we finally got a meatier story to sink our teeth into, which saw the trope developed quite significantly compared to what had come before. This time, our 4 fateful warriors had names and personalities from the start, as Bartz, Lenna and Faris were joined by the amnesiac Galuf before being replaced by his granddaughter Krill. Their tale began with a quest to save the 4 elemental crystals of earth, fire, wind and water before the fateful Warrior of Light title was applied to them, but unfortunately they failed in their task. All 4 crystals were shattered and the evil force known as XIII was unleashed upon the world. Bartz and company therefore travelled to XII's own world, and once there, Galuf regained his memory as it turned out he was also from there. He revealed that he was once known as a Warrior of the Dawn, and he fought alongside Zexat, Kelgar and Dorgan, Bartz's father. They had embarked on their own crystal quest with a different goal, to defeat XIII. They used the crystals to seal the evil sorcerer in another world, and Dorgan stayed behind in case XIII managed to break free. This was a neat twist on the simple Warrior of Light concept. Like the Warriors of Darkness from Final Fantasy III, the Warriors of the Dawn was a unique element used to differentiate Final Fantasy V from the others that had come before, while still employing the familiar foundational convention that we had been used to seeing. As the story progressed, Galuf chose to sacrifice himself for the cause, like his brethren had done before, and he was replaced by Krill. This would see the true formation of the Warriors of Light, who had hoped to finish what their predecessors could not. The game established the process of 4 people being anointed to save the world when it stood on the brink of destruction as something natural and automatic response to threats. It had happened before when XIII rose to power, and it would happen again in the forgotten sequel called Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals, which would actually have one of Bartz's descendants as one of the chosen 4. And furthermore, it happens in other worlds of the Final Fantasy series. You might be able to therefore guess what happened next in the story even if you haven't played the game. Bartz's party travelled beyond the simple worlds that they knew into the interdimensional void, where they would confront XIII at the height of his powers and defeat him, aided by the spirits of the Dawn Warriors, just as the Warriors of Light slew Chaos and the Onion Kids slew Cloud of Darkness. And at this point, I think we've actually seen enough of the trope to start a small checklist of its components. The Warriors of Light are 4 young heroes. They are the only ones who can save the world. They must go on a pilgrimage to gain elemental powers, they must travel beyond their own world, and they do so to confront the godlike entity that threatens all life. Final Fantasy V incorporated the Light Warrior trope from Final Fantasy I and III and checks all the same boxes, albeit with a bit more flair. It meant that we've been experiencing new versions of the original monomyth established in the first Final Fantasy, but each time it was being expanded upon with fresh layers of story. It would be a while though until the concept was used again, and even when it did resurface in Final Fantasy VIII, the Warriors of Light tag was left in the dust, as it was no doubt deemed too archaic. Nonetheless, the concept did largely hold true, it just didn't become clear until the latter parts of the game. The story began with a heavy focus on members of Balam Garden's Seed, a mercenary company tangled up in the resistance effort against an evil government. For the first half of the game, it appeared to be about Squall and his friends carrying out missions and trying to stop the evil sorceress Adia. Later on though, the plot thickened when we learned that 5 out of the 6 main characters once lived together in the same orphanage run by the very woman that they now opposed. They had just forgotten because their memories were erased gradually by exposure to Guardian forces. With fresh reservations in their hearts because of this newfound knowledge, the Seeds faced Edea one more time, but instead of killing her, they managed to break the seal which held her enthralled. Rinoa, another party member, then received the sorceress's powers as a consequence, and we learnt about the overarching antagonist called Sorceress Ultimacia, who resided in the future. And after she was defeated, important pieces of the puzzle were revealed, as during the confusion of Sorceress Ultimacia's time compression, we learnt that Squall was the one who actually told Edea about Seed and the coming threat of the sorceresses, inspiring her to create the organisation in the first place. And as a side note, if you'd like to learn more about that and Squall's story, we recommend checking out our video on Squall's origins. Due to the more developed narrative though, there's actually a lot more digging required to unearth the Light Warrior monomyth, and there have been some deviations within this story. For example, we no longer have 4 young heroes this time, as we instead have 5, Squall, Questis, Zell, Selphie and Irvine, and they're also joined by Rinoa, a companion. Like their earlier 8-bit and 16-bit ancestors, these 5 were chosen by destiny to save the world, in a way, because they were selected by Edea, who was herself inspired by Squall. The travel time paradox does make this a little bit more complex than it needed to be, but suffice to say, Edea and Cid appointed the kids of their orphanage to be the saviours of the world. One part that's clearly missing though is the pilgrimage to the crystals or to gain newfound strength. However, there is a definite journey beyond the hero's homeworld when Squall and company experience the time compression phenomenon and arrive in Ultimacia's future. This is actually similar to the time travel the original Light Warriors undertook to close Chaos's time loop, and here Ultimacia represents the ultimate evil that was previously unknown. It meant that while more creative license was taken with the Warrior of Light myth, its spirit and influence were very much alive in Squall's tale, and with Final Fantasy VIII we can really highlight and clarify one of the most fundamental elements of the Warrior of Light monomyth, divine appointment. The heroes are saving the world because they're fated or literally selected to do so, not because they actually want to save the world. It's within their character and their means to rise up against the world destruction, but the task was given to them by the hand of fate directly. For this reason, we've excluded stories like Final Fantasy IV, VII and IX. Cecil, Cloud and Zidane were inextricably bound to their respective main villains, but they were not directly hand-picked for the task per se. Their heroism wasn't foretold by prophecy, nor was the responsibility of saving the world given directly to them. With Final Fantasy X, however, there are again clear allusions to the Light Warrior motif, albeit again in a more subtle way. In this game, the elements of the trope are actually somewhat divided amongst the party members. Tidus is the specific Warrior of Light in question here. Think about it, he's selected by the sleeping people of Zanarkand to go to the mortal world and help to break Summoner Yevon's stranglehold on civilization. He's the chosen one, sent to save the world and break the curse, something which his relative was unable to do in the previous generation. And failing to break Yevon's stranglehold would mean that the cycle of pain and suffering would continue to repeat forever, of course if Seymour didn't end up destroying the world first. Yuna's true original guardians though are Wakka, Lulu and Kimahri, before Tidus, Auron and Riku arrive, and the plan had been for the 4 of them to make a pilgrimage to Zanarkand. They essentially echo the familiar 4-person squads of Light Warriors we've already seen. They even reflect one of the most common team compositions from the original Final Fantasy: Kimahri the Warrior, Wakka the Rogue, Yuna the White Mage and Lulu the Black Mage. But as others join Yuna, the unconventional size of her entourage becomes a topic of gossip amongst the people she meets. In this way, Tidus and Yuna share protagonist duties as well as the mantle of the Light Warrior. The party of 4 heroes, with some stragglers who also come along, make a literal pilgrimage to the elemental shrines in order to obtain the power to save the world. Tidus' whole journey also fulfills the otherworldly journey aspect of the monomyth, but it could also be considered that venturing inside Sin also represents this for the others. And together, only they, by the virtue of their love, can confront the overarching godlike entity that, behind the scenes, truly threatened the world. It's not only something they chose to do, but it was their designated destiny as well. Between our joint protagonists, all the elements of the Light Warrior myth are here. Final Fantasy X continued to take liberty with the myth, but if every game retold the myth without changing it up, it would end up being rather boring. Which brings us on to Final Fantasy XIII, where we can easily associate the l'Cie with Warriors of Light. Now, not every l'Cie is meant to be the saviour of the world, as they all have a different focus, but for the main characters of this game, their branding essentially made them into fabled warriors of light, even if that wasn't immediately the case. Think about it, the 4 pulsed l'Cie, Lightning, SARS, Hope and Snow, are our traditional party of warriors of light. They are branded by the fal'Cie anima due to the previous generation, Fang and Vanille, failing to complete their focus. Thus, anima imparts destiny upon these new warriors, hoping that they are able to accomplish what Fang and Vanille could not. It's rather similar to Final Fantasy V in that regard. Also, much like Tidus, Riku and Auron were to Yuna's party, Fang and Vanille acted as companions to Lightning's light warriors, but after being transported to Orphan's Cradle, an otherworldly place inside Eden, and confronting the overarching godlike entity called Orphan, Fang and Vanille are ultimately the ones who sacrifice themselves to save Cocoon and complete their focus. And due to the continuation of this series, things also didn't stop there, as Lightning is chosen to be the goddess Etro's champion and as the saviour by Benevelza. Instead of being selected by fal'Cie, the instruments of the gods, she becomes directly appointed by the deities themselves. And if we want to get really cheesy, it can't just be a coincidence that they chose to have characters shorten her name to Light after all, and she's even referred to as the Knight of Light in Lightning Returns. The pilgrimage motive doesn't really apply to Final Fantasy XIII per se though, but the l'Cie do journey across the lands. Sure, it's not to restore a set of elemental crystals, but by undertaking their journey, they unwittingly encounter struggles that allow Etro to enhance their powers through the bestowing of eidolons and elemental magics. It means that Final Fantasy XIII does keep the Light Warrior motif alive, but as we had seen with the 3 previous representations, it was in a more nuanced, distilled form as opposed to being front and centre. Lightning and company had some control, and unlike previous Warriors of Light, they chose to fight against their destiny and succeeded in not only defying it, but also changing it. And at this point, we can see that each Final Fantasy game that's chosen to adopt the Warrior of Light motif has chosen to shake it up a little bit, often due to more intricate storytelling becoming the norm, but also because implementing every single aspect of the motif just doesn't suit the narrative that they're working towards. When we therefore arrive at Final Fantasy XV, we can see that this is again the case, as while the narrative doesn't follow the original path laid down by Final Fantasy I to a T, in some ways it brings the Warrior of Light motif way back into the forefront. To break it down, there is a prophecy shown in the game's opening that claims when darkness veils the world, the king will come. This is a direct callback to the opening screen of Final Fantasy I, but instead of 4 orb-bearing warriors, the prophecy foretells a king, Noctis Lucis Caelum. Throughout the events of Final Fantasy XV, darkness does indeed veil the world of Eos. When the Niflheim Empire attacks the kingdom of Lucis, killing the king and stealing its crystal, the horrible threat of the Star Scourge intensifies. The night grows steadily longer, and the demons that hunt in darkness grow stronger and more numerous. Prince Noctis finds himself on a journey to gather the weapons of his ancestors and appease the Astrals, Eos' gods, almost equivalent to Aeons or Eidolons, in order to restore and reclaim his rightful throne. Noctis' journey seems very unique because of the game's open world design, but at its core, it's a typical Light Warrior pilgrimage. He travels around the world seeking the approval of the Astrals, who each represent an element and form a typical Final Fantasy pantheon. It's just like the original Light Warrior, but with gigantic deities in an open world setting instead of crystals in isolated dungeons. The prophecy doesn't specifically mention any companions in its wording, but the Genesis painting does show the Warrior of Light with 3 companions, and Noct does travel in a group of 4 with Gladiolus, Prompto and Ignis, not unlike the traditional Warriors of Light. Once again, we have a quartet of 4 young heroes, and there's even an allusion to a previous generation of heroes, including Noctis' father, Regis, something that we saw, of course, in Final Fantasy V. In the original vision of the game, Cor was also meant to be part of their band, which would have made the connection to Final Fantasy V even stronger. As the last of his bloodline, not the Warrior of Light but as the King of Light, Noctis is the only person who can truly save the world. And while he's the only one chosen for the task, he openly admits that he could not achieve it without his friends. As for the otherworldly aspect, well, Final Fantasy XV pays homage to the original, but does so in a rather sneaky way. Noctis doesn't necessarily travel through time as the first Light Warriors did to confront Chaos, but he does spend 10 years sleeping inside the crystal to unlock the powers he needs to use in the final showdown. When he awakes, Eos is practically a different world, consumed by never-ending night. Lucis is a graveyard, someone else sits on the throne, and demons roam freely. This is not his world, and he will pay the ultimate price to restore it. All the elements are there, incorporated organically, and more directly than any other Final Fantasy since Final Fantasy V. You could easily just slap a horned helmet on Noctis' head and it wouldn't seem out of place, and it would probably make more sense than that cup noodle hat. Either way, now that we've seen the elements of the Warrior of Light motif and examined how they've been used throughout the series, it's perhaps easiest to see how the concept has grown if we compare them all side by side. The core story elements we've isolated again are these. The Warriors of Light are 4 young heroes. They are the only ones who can save the world. They will take a pilgrimage to gain elemental powers, they will travel beyond their own world, and they will do so to confront the godlike entity that threatens all life. The first 3 games we looked at, 1, 3 and 5, employ this motif perfectly, even using the name Light Warriors in the story directly. Check marks all round. Final Fantasy VIII took the motif in a new direction, but it still presented most of the core elements. We instead had 5 young heroes and their sorceress friend. They were chosen by Idea to be the only ones who could save the world. The elemental pilgrimage was missing, but they did travel beyond their own world to confront a godlike villain. One element is missing, but the spirit of the motif is intact, powering the narrative discreetly. Final Fantasy X split the role of Destined Saviour between Tidus and Yuna, and together they can check all the boxes on our scorecard. Yuna's original party had 4 members, even if it nearly doubles in size later on. Tidus is chosen to be the saviour, though Yuna can also fit this role as the daughter of the High Summoner. They then take a literal pilgrimage to the elemental temples before heading inside Sin to confront the godlike villain. Tidus' entire journey could also be considered as otherworldly, and of course there's even a glaring hint in the famous opening song called Otherworld. Final Fantasy XIII presented a party of 4 heroes, with 2 from the previous generation acting as companions, and they are chosen at the start of the story by a divine power. Although they were supposed to destroy the world of Cocoon, after fighting against their focus, they are able to save the world instead. We can give them half marks on the elemental pilgrimage score, as they don't actively go on one, but they do gain elemental powers along the way due to their eidolons. But yes, they do travel to another world, and they do confront a godlike villain. And in a surprising conclusion, we have Final Fantasy XV paying direct homage to the series' roots more faithfully than the 3 previous examples before it. The chosen hero travels in a party of 4. He undertakes a pilgrimage to seek out the approval of the elements. He travels to a dark world where his enemy is victorious and confronts the godlike villain. It's quite a cut and dry interpretation of the Warrior of Light monomyth. Realistically though, we are only scratching the surface here because we are only looking at the main series games. Sequels and spin-offs have played heavily with the Warrior of Light motif as well. Most obvious is of course the Nintendo 3DS's Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light, but there's also the Bravely Default games that spawn from it, and there's also Final Fantasy Dimensions. All of these are traditional old school games that, narratively speaking, could fit right into the main numbered series. They're rife with story elements similar to the earliest Final Fantasies, even referring to their protagonists directly as warriors or heroes of light. Mobius also explores the motif as it was used in the original Final Fantasy, putting players in the shoes of Wall, a blank who may become the next Warrior of Light. Wall's goal is to become the anonymous hero of the first game and slay Chaos. As the l'Cie of Final Fantasy XIII can be seen as an equivalent to Light Warriors, in a way Type 0 also continues this metaphor with his own interpretation of l'Cie. Where l'Cie in Final Fantasy XIII considered cursed and evil, in Type 0 the burden of being l'Cie is something to be proud of. It's a way of giving service to one's country. In the Dissidia series, the heroes are generally considered warriors of Cosmos, essentially the same term, given that Cosmos is the goddess of harmony and light in that universe. And I think the fact that this motif appears so prominently outside of the original game and the main series speaks volumes for how important it is to the Final Fantasy brand. And it all means that even though the motif was created over 2 decades ago, modern day Final Fantasy games still draw upon it for inspiration. The Light Warriors are so much more than just a trope. They are the cornerstone of Final Fantasy mythology, still informing the series' narratives subtly and unsubtly. But this is just one of the many recurring motifs or tropes running throughout the series, and as mentioned, we're planning to explore more in the future. Be sure to let us know in the comments if there are any specific ones you'd like us to take a look at, and of course, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Thanks once again to Patreon supporter Richard Sivak for suggesting we examine how tropes have changed throughout the series' history. If you would like to suggest another topic, why not consider supporting us on Patreon? You can find out more information at patreon.com/ffunion or by clicking on the link in the description. Everyone you're seeing now has actually already made the active decision to support us, and it would be great to see this number continuing to grow. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. This video was quite the undertaking, and I'd really like to thank Chris aka Hookathy for helping us out with it. For now though, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you all soon for some more Final Fantasy videos.